Hello, comrades. Good evening. Tonight's Culture Club has two really interesting sessions. We're starting with a review of Strike, a documentary about the miners' strike, particularly Orgreave. And then we're taking a look at a book called Citizen Marx. And that's a really important way of looking at Marx. And I hope comrades are as interested in it as I am. So we're starting with Strike. And I was going to try and show the trailer, but actually we've sent it out in the email, so we don't need to show it tonight. And do watch the film, watch the trailer. It is a very interesting take on particularly Orgreave and what happened there, Orgreave, and particularly the planned nature of it all. And this film is very partisan. It's with the miners, it's with their communities, with their families. There are interviews with miners, 4 or 5 of them, then and now, and both are very moving. It must have been particularly moving for all those who were in the miner strike and who played a leading role, be it, the women as well, as supporting women or the miners. And when I went to the cinema in Sheffield, there was not a dry eye in the house. Joining us to discuss it a bit more is John Dunn of the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. John, what I found particularly interesting, the testaments are very interesting and moving, but what I found particularly interesting is that the film is very clear about the strike having been provoked by Thatcher's Tory government. Yes, as revenge for Saltley Gates in 1972, the miners' strike, where a picket led by the young Arthur Scargill won huge concessions from the government. And then there was another very successful miners' strike in 1974. And the film explains very well that was one of the things that really got Margaret Thatcher going, but also she wanted to take on the unions, and by starting with the strongest union in order to break them all. The film's very, I've not seen it that clear, that point being made quite so clear in a film about the miners' strike. Is that, you think, hindsight talking, or were you aware of it at the time, this provocational nature?
Oh, I think from very early on, we knew what was happening. We had, from literally the first week at strike, we had police roadblocks, you couldn't get anywhere. Nottinghamshire, we had pickets in Nottinghamshire who were very effective at actually shutting Coalfield down. That's never gets talked about, unfortunately. But what happened is then the police moved in, and my strike centre in Clay Cross, we actually had people staying in Blydydd, near Mansfield, in people's houses. And one night, the police came and literally rounded everybody up and escorted them out of the village. And at the same time, all the telephone boxes, we didn't have mobiles, obviously, went down, so nobody could get a call out or anything. And we now know that Thatcher had instructed the police, the courts, and everything very early on to do this. So yeah, it were. I mean, the strike had been provoked. We knew that because the overtime ban we were on, that we've been on since October, and it's important to remember that, had been very successful. We drastically lowered coal stocks. We were cutting them by some 8 million tons a week. So they knew they had to do something.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. It mentions the manifest, which was an interesting piece of history. Can you explain to us what the manifest is and how they've tried to hide it?
Well, it actually came out during Orgreave trial. The secret police tactics document that are based on experiences in Northern Ireland, and that literally instructs police on the procedures to follow in any what they refer to as civil disturbances. And it actually uses words like incapacitate, which have never been heard. These nice, kind, friendly policemen that help old ladies across the street and things like that, were being given instructions on how to incapacitate literally anyone they needed to. So that came out, and also it they tried to deny that this had ever happened. They turned the whole theory around that it was us that were being violent, and that they were only responding and protecting innocent people that wanted to go to work. But it's obvious you don't prepare something like this if you're not going to use it. It were a blueprint on literally how to deal with us.
Yeah, I thought it was a slightly sort of naive touch about perhaps policing, and that it tried to make a difference between policing overseas. They were always mean in the colonies, but in Britain they were quite soft, etc., and they were quite civilized. But I mean, the miners' strike in 26, the general strike. I mean, they weren't particularly soft then, were they?
No, and the Fitzwilliam riots and things like that. Churchill ordering troops to fire on striking miners if necessary.
Could go back to Peterborough as well, or the foundation of the modern metropolitan police over that. There's an interesting bit as well where they're showing, and that reminded me totally about Hillsborough. Where they told the coppers, there's two coppers in the film, one decent enough and one is sort of not so nice, but the decent enough ones said quite clearly, this we were trying to write down our evidence statement, and I was told, and it was an instruction to put this paragraph in, this particular paragraph, and that came out as well, didn't it, in the trial, that all the coppers had the same exact paragraph in it.
Yeah, they not only had the exact same phraseology, but also they got the wrong copper arresting the wrong person, and one copper actually were off on leave when he allegedly arrested somebody. And we witnessed that. That weren't just at Orgreave. That happened. Every time there were a trial of any pig. It's happened to me as a result of what happened to me very early on.
Yeah, go on. What happened? You weren't actually in Orgreave, was it?
No. What happened was early on in April the 9th, actually, we're on a large picket at Cresswell Colliery, part of the Nottinghamshire coalfield, but actually in Derbyshire, dating back to Spencer Union times in 26. And we'd had a very peaceful picket. We were dispersing when a copper decided to smash the back of my head in. And the interesting thing is that that were one of the first instances of them starting to get really violent. My area, Derbyshire NUM, we took 3 private summonses out. We sued 2 chief constables, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and we sued the copper who'd done me, and as a way of trying to expose this. And when I appeared in court several months later, again, it were a bit like the Orgreave transcripts. Everybody tried to tell the same story, and when we disproved the first copper said, "Oh, my hair were a different shade of blonde in them days," and there was a lot more of it. One copper said we could recognise Mr. Dunby's long flowing locks that were illuminated in the pit floodlights. And so my barrister said, well, it's on record that the pit floodlights went out an hour before Mr. Dunn's. So, then the next one comes in and don't mention the floodlights, but they could see my long flowing locks. They even described the clothing I was wearing wrong. This camouflage jacket that I allegedly wore. And we produced a little black bomber jacket, still stained in blood. And then the most embarrassing thing of all, they all said that, now you've heard me speak many a time, Tina. And if you've ever heard me use a phrase like this, then correct me. I allegedly stood at the front of the picket and incited a charge against the police by shouting out, "Come on, chaps, let's get them." Now,
That's very posh, John.
yeah. I mean, I
Like that.
obviously lapsed into into something London or something like that. But yeah, so again, all through the strike, they were doing this, framing evidence, being told what to say, and they had to find me guilty to quash them 3 private summonses, else we would have exposed what was happening. And an interesting thing is in 2018, I sent a Freedom of Information request off to, because I'm trying to clear my name. I got 2 criminal convictions as a result. And I got a letter back saying, with no record of your arrest. So how do you end up with 2 criminal convictions being tried in before a stipendiary magistrate when you were never arrested?
Jesus, so they had to clear it?
No, I've still got them convictions.
No,
I can't clear them because I can't prove what happened to me.
Right. Oh, that sounds like Kafka, doesn't it? Jesus Christ. So what did you make of the film? And when I initially approached you, say it's brilliant, but there are a few weaknesses. What's the plus for you, the best things, and what do you think?
I think it's plus. I'd actually say it's the best one made. And actually, they wanted to try and get a broadcaster to screen it, and nobody would touch it. Not even Channel 4, who actually did a 3-part series earlier this year, of which 2 heavily featured scabs. None of those would touch it, and so it became an independently funded cinema thing. And I do think it's by far the best made. And what I really do like about it is it's about the people who were actually involved, not just at Aubrey, but for that whole year. And it deals with the emotions then and now. And as you say, it's a tearjerker. And, you know, when you see the most battle-hardened miners in floods of tears, seeing something like this, I thought it were actually tremendous, and I congratulate the fella who made it. And I think it covers every aspect. It covers the aftermath of what we've got now, the ongoing grief, the ongoing suffering. And so I like that bit of it. It's not just about, oh, this were a great gladiatorial contest and this. It's about the people and about how it affected them. And, you know, it was a scary time. You know, you can be as, you know, put as much bravado on as you like. But you went on a picket line not knowing whether you were going to live at times. We had 2 murdered. Never forget. Now, the weakness that you mentioned, in particular the main one, is they give credence to Nick Jones, who was the BBC's industrial correspondent, who still to this day paints it in this Scargill versus Thatcher. And he goes at great length to say we couldn't settle because Scargill wouldn't settle. As if, you know, it were these 2 intransigent beings that were causing all this, and we 100,000 miners that were on strike were just, you know, sheep following Arthur, and that's the thing that I hate and why they've done that. I think that might have been in an attempt to get it taken up by a broadcaster or to get it distributed, you know, in cinemas. Luckily, it's in a lot of cinemas. But if you ignore that bit, it's a tremendous documentary.
What do you think about, I mean, it is a bit critical on the ballot question as well, which was a big controversy on the left at the time. Can you explain it to us a little bit, what the question of the ballot was and how it was used to, you know, discredit it?
Well, it became the demand of the media, the the scabs, and it's quite simple that it was never a national strike. Arthur, I've had the great privilege of speaking on a lot of platforms with Arthur Scargill, who at 86 is still going strong. He makes the point that it was an area strike. It started off when Corton Wood decided to walk out and ask for solidarity and support. And the NUM, being a federated union, a collection of areas, has a rule that says that individual areas can make strikes in their area official. So once Corton Wood had started picketing the Yorkshire coalfield out, it was obvious that the Yorkshire Area Council were going to make that strike official. And then what happened is obviously it rolled on. When they came into Derbyshire, I remember a few days after it had started in Yorkshire, when they picketed our pit, we went to local miners' welfare, Duckmanton Miners' Welfare, and had a show of hands, the most democratic form of voting there is. And to think that once a strike is gathering momentum like that you can suddenly say, stop, lads, we want you to go and have a vote and then decide whether to start again. We've seen what's happening these days with these stop starts, a day here, 2 days here, strikes that we've got that eventually lose momentum. And, the ballot, I do think if we'd had one, we would have won it and won it resoundingly, but it were not necessary. It could not have happened. And it was just a ruse to try and it were turned into, Arthur Scargill refuses, and it's still said to this day, refuses to let his men have a democratic ballot. Well, what's democratic about people who thought they were safe in a coalfield voting to put me or somebody else out of work in another pit? So it's just, for me, it's a total red herring. And unfortunately, we were taken up by quite a few on left at the time.
Yes. I was very young at the time, but I do actually remember.
I hate it when people say that, Tina.
I was 10, but being in Germany, and I thought kind of that was missing a little bit. There was a huge international solidarity wave as well, and in Britain, it doesn't really show that in the film, which I thought is a bit of a shame. It looks quite insular, when in fact it was massive, wasn't it? I mean, comrades tell me here when they stood at the tube station in London, all you had to do is hold up a bucket, and money was flying, and you didn't even have to say anything. Everybody knew they're collecting for the miners. So it was hugely popular amongst the population, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. And this whole idea that Britain were divided, I get asked this question with media over and over again, is nonsense. One of the great things that happened to me as a result of what happened at Cresswell is my area said, we don't want you going on any pickets because if you get arrested again, it'll kill these summonses. So they put me in charge of setting up support groups and fundraising. And I went all over the country speaking at conferences, setting up support groups in the most obscure places. And it was incredible. People couldn't do enough for you. And then, there were the donations of food when the printers sent lorry load of food for Christmas. The French miners, and I was at Sheffield City Hall for a rally when Alain Simon, the leader of one of the French unions, said that every miner's child will have a present for Christmas. And we did. We got, I remember going down at Goldwell Rooms in Chesterfield and just seeing this vast room full of kids' toys. Oh. And ardent miners weeping at the sight of it, because we expected it to be a bit of a dismal Christmas. We got, we had turkey. It was the best Christmas anybody could ever have. So, and you know, the women who went out didn't just man soup kitchens, went out speaking, fundraising, played an invaluable part in that, and it were incredible. I visited. I actually ended up in Rome fundraising at the end of the strike and got a tremendous reception there. And yeah, it were wonderful.
That's probably also why Thatcher took them on in their miners, because it was whole villages, whole cities, little areas were basically organized, self-organized, and they were in the hands of the working class, and that had to be broken up. Can I ask you something slightly controversial, perhaps, and that is the role of coal? I mean, what was also very common at the time was saying, that we just have to move forward. Coal is dirty, it's old, etc. We have to move away from it. I know the German government is building new coal plants now, which has to do with Ukraine, of course, and not wanting to take Russian gas anymore. But it's not over, is it? It's not finished.
The world burns more coal than ever, and to think that it were closed because for environmental reasons is nonsense. We have the most advanced clean coal technology, and if anybody ever tells you that coal cannot be used or burnt cleanly, then they're way off beam. Up to 2014, there were plans at Hatfield Colliery in Stainforth for an experimental clean coal power station, and David Cameron shut that in his last act of spite. It's not a dirty fuel. We've got the ridiculous notion now that that nuclear power stations are somehow clean when their waste product is used to make spent uranium in bombs. And so it's nonsense. And also, coal being a carbon product can make literally anything. You wouldn't even have to burn it. You could use it. Nylon used to be made out of it. ICI, as a byproduct, as a waste product, used to make petrol from it. So, the ridiculous thing is there's thousands of years supply of a cheap, efficient fuel that can be used cleanly, and it's been sterilized. And instead we've got, people unable to afford to put the heating on in winter. I will advocate for clean coal while ever I've got breath.
There's probably cleaner energy sources, but we're not going to go into that. I'm not an expert on this, but clearly it was a political decision rather than, as you say, an environmental decision, or, you need to move forward and coal is old-fashioned, etc. But lastly now then, what is the state of play with the Orgreave inquiry? Do you think now that we have a Labour Party Prime Minister, there's more chance of that being revived and there actually will be a proper inquiry?
I prefer to refer to them as the party formerly known as Labour. Now, what our campaign has said is we're carrying on campaigning. We know that we have 13 years of an alleged Labour government that could have done this. And what is most worrying to me personally is that what they've pledged is an investigation or an inquiry. Well, an investigation is something totally different. What do? Just get some retired judge to look at some files or something? No. And as a result, we're going to keep the campaign going because we want a full independent inquiry along the lines of the one that the Brave Hillsborough campaign has secured, that eventually got them some kind of victory. So, and also, let's face it, the Starmer, as it seems to have a little bit of a habit for reneging on promises. So I'm not holding my breath. And if it happens, it will be a bonus. It's definitely a step forward reckoning. But these people are the ones who sabotaged Corbyn, who had pledged for a full independent inquiry along the lines of what we were asking. And I do worry that, you know, our campaign, which has been very successful since 2012, might be forgotten in all this, and more respectable people might be the ones that get to be. We've already got people who've done nothing trying to take credit for it.
But the way I know you, you're going to make a lot of noise about it.
I don't know what you're inferring there.
I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, John.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. See you in Durham. Durham on Saturday.
Yeah, everybody get up to Durham because we're still here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll hope if you can see the film somewhere, please go and see it. It is really, really very good, very brilliant. Thank you for joining us, John. Our second part, welcome to Bruno Leipold. Hello. I thought you were older. It's good to see a young person taking an interest in what I think is a hugely important political question, and which is the question of Marxism and democracy, republicanism. There are very many Marxists on the left, particularly in Britain, who will reluctantly say, whenever there's a royal wedding or something, like, yeah, we should abolish the monarchy, yeah, mainly because it's so expensive and, you know, they're parasites, I think this really underestimates and misunderstands Marx's relationship to democracy and republicanism, which, you know, calling themselves Marxists, they should really, really know that. Marx put the fight for republic really at the center of some of his work, and Engels, of course, as well. They were a team. And I'm very pleased that we have Bruno with us, who's written a book on this question called Citizen Marx. And he's now going to introduce the book, and then we're going to ask him some questions afterwards. Welcome, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you to the group for the invitation. Can you hear me okay, Tina?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
And thank you so much, John, for your talk as well. I found that very moving and very humbled by listening to it, especially the story you told about the Christmas presents coming over from France. I always find those stories of international solidarity very beautiful. So thank you very much for that as well. I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully that works okay.
Yes, we can see them. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming to listen to me. I'm talking for the next half hour or so about a book that I have recently written and which will come out in... actually, just going to take out my earphones because they're echoing a little bit and it's annoying. 1 second. That's still okay, Tina, sound-wise?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Okay, now that's easy. It's not so... Okay, so this is the book that I have written, Citizen Marx, Republicanism and the Formation of Karl Marx's Social and Political Thought, and it'll be out in November of this year. I've been writing it for quite a long time, so it was my PhD. I've been working on the topic for like nearly more than 10 years, so it's a bit of a relief to finally see it kind of like getting out there. It's I don't know if anyone else has done like a very long project like that, because one of those things that just never felt like it would ever end. So I'm very glad that it's out there. What shall I say? Well, maybe I can start with a little bit of the front cover, why I chose this image. So if you can look a little bit carefully, you'll see that there's Marx sitting there down to the left. This is basically a picture from the late cartoon image from the late 19th century from the German SPD, celebrating the workers, the SPD's victory in the 1890 election or something. And you can see that it's a worker in the center of the image who's being congratulated by the goddess Liberty, presented in this very Republican fashion with the kind of liberty cap from the French Revolution. And you can see various like Republican figures from Republican history in the background. So people like Robert Blum from the 1848 revolutions, the Gracchi brothers from the Roman Republic. And so it has this kind of image of kind of like this Republican inheritance kind of crowning the socialist worker. And so that kind of gets to a lot of the themes that my book is about. You can kind of also see on the right, there's an urn there that says Allgemeines Wahlrecht, which is German for universal suffrage. So it's also about how the workers have used their newfound democratic rights to defeat the dragon of reaction, which you can kind of maybe just see there in the background. So that's just a little bit about the image. Well, of all places to start, why don't I start with the title? Why have I called it Citizen Marx? Maybe that might need some explanation. Well, so essentially, citizen was the title that all radicals in the 19th century, from as an inheritance from the French Revolution, used as a way to address each other as a kind of replacement for aristocratic titles. So instead of Lord or King or whatever, you become citizen something. So Citizen Windsor rather than Queen Windsor and so forth. And that is also true of socialists. And it's not until like the late 19th century that citizen gets replaced by comrade. And that means that for all of Marx's life, he always refers to, signs his letters, Citizen Marx. He writes to others in Citizen, and it kind of captures this Republican history to socialism. And you can see an example here of it. This is the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto, which is published in 1850, 2 years after it comes out in German, in the newspaper, The Red Republican. And they are here introduced as citizens Charles Marx and Frederick Engels. And so you can see there that, citizens being used in that kind of, very common established way. And this newspaper is quite an interesting one, The Red Republican. So it's a kind of radical Chartist journal. Published in London, and it's called The Red Republican because it's bringing together these kind of two traditions of republicanism and socialism and combining them together. And that's a kind of new development in the mid-19th century of which Marx and Engels are part of. And I'll speak to that a little bit later in the presentation, what that means, bringing these two traditions together. Now, it's the first English translation. It's not the translation that most people here will be familiar with. That is the translation that comes about 30 years later or so. So a lot of the formulations in it are quite different. I actually think it's a really interesting translation. There's a lot of interesting word choices. I mean, so for instance, instead of petty bourgeoisie, the translator referred to them as shopocrats, which I think is a rather nice, rather beautiful little term. And so the translator is actually Helen Macfarlane, who's an early kind of feminist, socialist, and Scottish woman, very interesting figure in her own right. And she produces this really interesting translation that unfortunately is today only known for one thing, which is it's a very interesting translation, but it does have a very weird opening line. So rather than a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, this starts a frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe. Not quite clear why she chose a hobgoblin to translate the German, but it kind of unfortunately detracts from what is otherwise a very interesting translation. So that just gives you a little bit of an opening as to why is it called Citizen Marx, as it were. What is the argument that I'm making in the book? The kind of very central point that I want to make in the book. So I guess the most central thing that I want to say is that if you want to understand Marx's thought properly, you need to understand how important and how central republicanism was to Marx's thought. And one way you can kind of understand what I mean by that is to think about the different intellectual influences on Marx's thought and what is generally, taken to be the important influences. So there's a very influential account of Marx's influence given by Lenin in 1913 or so. And he says that there's three important influences on Marx's thought, which Marx then synthesized. The first being German philosophy, the second being French socialism, and the third being English political economy. And Lenin says this is the what you need to understand Marx's thought, that he synthesized these three different traditions. Now, this kind of triadic account is a little bit problematic for various reasons. I mean, for one thing, it's not really English political economy. It's actually mostly Scottish political economy, but that's a kind of typical 19th century conflation of England with Britain and so forth. And it kind of reduce the idea that Marx wasn't influenced by English socialism rather than French socialism is also quite problematic. But in any case, if we are to take this triadic account as given, one of the most problematic things, I think, from the perspective of my book is that I think it misses out one extra very important intellectual source for Marx's ideas, and that is the idea of European republicanism. And that's what the book is trying to establish, that there is this neglected other source for Marx's ideas that we need to understand if we want to get a better understanding of Marx's ideas. And I mean that when I mean influence, I don't just mean in the sense that Marx just takes over everything from republicanism. So it's not just like what we might call positive influence. It's also negative influence. It's also he reacts against republicanism because republicanism is a competing political movement at the time. So it's both a source of inspiration and something that he reacts against. And that's what my book is trying to establish. Now, at this point, perhaps it'd be useful to give a little bit of a sense of what republicanism is. So I think the problem with republicanism as a term is that we use it today to mean something quite rather not unrelated, but a little bit different to what it meant in the 19th century and before that. So, today, of course, you say republicanism, you either mean the US Republican Party, maybe you mean like a fight for Irish independence, or maybe you mean in the UK that you're an anti-monarchist. Now, those are all related to the historical understanding of what republicanism is, but they don't fully explain and they don't fully align with it. So I think a good way to understand what republicanism is in the 19th century at the time in which Marx is writing is to think of it as, well, this is why I've got this cartoon up here. So if we think that, if you're asked to describe the modern political landscape, you'd often say that there are kind of three big political ideologies. There's kind of socialism, liberalism, and conservatism, right? And those are the big three that kind of dominate the political spectrum. Now, in the 19th century, rather than that being socialism on the left, it was republicanism on the left. And that's what you can see in this image here. You've got, this is a German cartoon from 1850 or so. So you've got the radical Republican there on the left, the liberal constitutionalist in the middle, and the conservative absolute monarchist on the right. And those are the big three political factions before socialism really comes onto the scene and then replaces and integrates republicanism on the left. And I'll try and say a little bit, how is republicanism different to these other things? So one way you can understand it is what political regime are these three different forces fighting for? So conservatives on the right are fighting to keep or maintain absolute monarchies. So that's, for example, places like Russia or Prussia, where the king has kind of absolute control. There are no elected assemblies of any kind. There's only feudal forms of representation. And there's a very limited, very, very limited set of civic rights, if at all, right? Then on the very left of the political spectrum, you have Republicans who are fighting for a democratic republic. So they want universal manhood suffrage. They want elected assemblies. They want full civic rights for everyone. And then in the middle, you've got liberals who are arguing for a kind of compromise between these two, in their eyes, extreme positions. And they believe in what is called what they would call a constitutional monarchy, which means that they still want to keep the king, but they want to have that king to be constrained and basically just a figurehead, and to have elected assemblies, but very importantly, elected on a property suffrage. So they want to they want to introduce some form of representation, but they don't want, let's say, the working class to take part in that representation. And that's the really important thing to understand about the 19th century, how republicanism and liberalism divide. The liberalism is not a democratic tradition at this point. That changes in the later 19th century, but that's the real big difference between Republicans and liberals. So let me say maybe a little bit more about what's important about republicanism. So it is at its heart a democratic tradition, right? So in a way, you can think of it as the ideology of democracy. So they are trying to establish democratic regimes. And I think really important to understand is that there are no democratic regimes at the time in which Marx is alive in Marx's writing in Europe. That is even true to the day he dies. There is no universal manhood suffrage anywhere in Europe, I believe, and there's certainly not universal suffrage in the sense of including women as well. And that's the political environment that Marx is operating on, and that's so easily forgotten that he's really not even operating within democratic conditions. He's operating in pre-feudal, oftentimes, conditions, trying to get there. Sorry, I think I'm rambling a little bit too much on republicanism. One important thing that I want to make about republicanism that I think is very important to why republicanism has become a big theme in political theory and in academic discussions is because one thing that's been kind of unearthed from the Republican tradition is that in line with this idea of democracy, that Republicans have a very specific understanding of liberty. or freedom, what is sometimes called liberty as independence or freedom as non-domination. And that's different to the main ways in which we talk about freedom today. So the kind of one way which, freedom is often talked about today, what you might think about how freedom is discussed, let's say by neoliberals or in kind of very mainstream discussions, it's kind of idea of freedom as in non-interference. So you're just free when someone doesn't interfere with you. It's kind of very simple idea of freedom. And Republicans disagree with that because they believe that actually freedom comes down to whether you are dominated by or not. And domination is a more encompassing idea than interference is. So particularly you can think of domination, for example, as, let's say, if you're a slave and a slave owner, that is a very typical relationship of domination, employer and employee, debtor and debtor, husband and wife. These can be very examples of domination. When someone has arbitrary power over someone, when they have the arbitrary power to interfere in your life. And that might mean that they never actually interfere. They just have the power to do so. So it's more about whether someone maintains that possible power over you rather than whether they actually exercise it or not. And that is something that we see throughout the 19th century being still used by Republicans. So kind of very typical definition of liberty given in the 19th century. Félicité de Lamennais, for example, a very important French Republican, argues that personal liberty or the right to live and act freely implies the absence of any will or any power which would impose arbitrary limits on the same liberty. That is to say, it implies the cooperation of each member of society in the law that governs society. And there you see a really important aspect to this idea of Republican liberty, which is that in order to be free, you have to have democratic participation in your government, right? So otherwise, you are subjected to arbitrary power, right? So what the king, his aristocrats, his bureaucrats can do with what you like if you don't. And the alternative to that is having a democratic regime in which you control the government over you, and that is constitutive of your freedom. And as another example in there, but I just wanted to maybe highlight, this is the English Republic written by William James Linton. This is in the 19th century, mid-19th century again, just an example of the kind of Republican ideas being also spreading in England at the time as well. So you can see here on the right his design for an English tricolour with the kind of blue, white and green, which I think is rather beautiful in some ways, quite tranquil as tricolours go. Okay. I hope that gives some sense of what republicanism is. This thing that I'm saying is very important to understanding Marxist thought. And I'm very happy to answer more questions about that afterwards. Okay, now I've said that republicanism is very important for understanding Marxist thought. I think I should say now more about how is it important, right? So, what is the actual argument about how it influences him? Well, so what I argue in the book is that republicanism's influence on Marxist thought, or his relationship to Marxist thought, is best understood as three broad phases in Marx's life. So first, at the beginning of Marx's life, when he kind of enters the public sphere, he enters it as a Republican, committed to a democratic republic with widespread civic participation. He then transitions from that position to a communist position, which, as I will try and explain a little bit, both integrates and rejects aspects of his prior republicanism. And that's his kind of position for the kind of dominant period of his life. And then towards the end of his life, in response to the Paris Commune, this kind of popular uprising in Paris, he reintegrates some of the most popular elements of his early republicanism, coming to a fuller synthesis of his republicanism. And that's the kind of broad sweep of the book's arguments, these three stages to Marx's life and its relationship to republicanism. And so I want to say maybe, in the next 15 minutes or so, maybe spend about, a few minutes on each of these phases and just give you, I hope, a taste of the kind of arguments that I'm making. So let's talk first about Marx's early republicanism before he becomes a communist and a socialist. So very important to understand about Marx's early thought is that he starts out as a journalist after he is unable to become an academic because of the Prussian regime's crackdown on young Hegelian thought, this kind of attempt to radicalize Hegel's ideas. And that kind of bans them from taking part in academic work, and Marx turns to journalism. This is his first career, as it were. And he sets up, he joins called the Rheinische Zeitung, and he writes, a series of important articles and then becomes an editor of it. And it's a very difficult environment in which to work. So he's dealing with daily pre-censorship. So it's not even that, you publish something and the government might then, take action for you afterwards. You have to submit everything you write every evening at the newspaper to the censor, who reads over it and then gives you permission whether to publish or not. So it's a very, very restrictive environment that Marx is working in. So you can only be he has to be quite careful with everything that he says. But within that, he does manage to defend some important ideas, kind of more radical ideas, and his criticisms of Marx, of the Prussian regime in which he lives in. The first thing is that Marx talks, unsurprisingly, very extensively about press freedom. So this is a kind of central concern of his early journalism. And it's actually the very first article that Marx ever publishes in his life is on press freedom. And one of his criticisms is that the kind of press of the existing censorship regime is that it's a completely arbitrary setup, that the censor who sits above the journalist just kind of arbitrarily decides this can go, this cannot, and it's just down to their whim what goes and what's not. And an alternative to that, Marx says that press freedom should be the press should be properly regulated under law. And he gives extensive defense of the rule of law in his early writings. So he says, for example, I do not at all believe that persons can be a guarantee against laws. On the contrary, I believe that laws must be a guarantee against persons. No one, not even the most excellent legislator, can be allowed to put himself above the law he has made. And he tells us that the difference between censorship and a real press law, which brings under regulation, is the difference is arbitrariness and freedom. And so there you start to see this real, opposition between the idea of arbitrariness and freedom, that these are opposites. And that's when it comes to what Marx actually thinks that freedom involves in his early writings. So he tells us that laws are not repressive measures against freedoms. Laws are rather that positive, clear, universal norms in which freedom has acquired an impersonal, theoretical existence independent of the arbitrariness of the individual. A statute book is a people's Bible of freedom. So what Marx is there making an argument is that you're not made unfree by law, which is a kind of view, like a modern neoliberal view, that laws inherently limit your freedom because they interfere with you, they stop you doing what you want. But on the Republican view, that's not necessarily the case, because if laws are non-arbitrary, then the interference with you is not an arbitrary interference, and therefore it doesn't make you unfree. But the important thing is, why would law be not arbitrary in that way? Why would that be true? And for Marx, it's not just that it can be any law, it has to be law that is democratically made. So he tells us that law is non-arbitrary when law is the conscious expression of the popular will and then it originates with it and is created by it. So it's really this idea that democratically made law is what constitutes your freedom in Marx's early writings here. And that's his kind of Republican view of freedom. We also find some interesting ideas that he talks about representation. So he talks about the important that what I think his idea of democracy that he's defending in his early writings is not simply an idea about direct democracy, but neither is it the kind of representative democracy that we're familiar with today. He kind of thinks it's very important that representation, that you have a very tight control over your representatives, a kind of in-between model, which is kind of easily neglected in our understanding of democracy today. And you kind of see his kind of sense of what a more expansive ideal that he looks like, what his political ideal looks like at this time. So he tells it it's about transforming the mysterious priestly nature of the state into a clear-cut entity of the ordinary people, accessible to all, belonging to all, making the state the flesh and blood of its citizens. Now, of course, he can't flesh that out in any greater detail because of the threat of censorship. He goes into a bit more detail in his early writings when he writes a fairly well-known critique of Hegel, where he's talking so Hegel provides this kind of grand liberal justification of what the state should look like, and Marx provides essentially a radical Republican critique of it. That involves, for example, while Hegel defends the idea of popular sovereignty, Marx responds by saying that Hegel is just confused and defending a garbled notion of sovereignty, and that actually what we need is popular sovereignty, so the people are the only legitimate source of authority, legitimate authority. While Hegel defends a kind of exclusive setup where there's kind of a landed aristocracy in the upper house, a lower house with a property franchise, which have no constraints, Marx then defends the idea that it's completely unreasonable to have a legislature where the right to sit in is entrusted to a particular race of men. He says that it's the right of all to be real active members of the state. And then he says that, the kind of representatives who are not, closely bound by instructions, formally they are commissioned, but once they are actually commissioned, they are no longer mandatories. They are supposed to be deputies and they are not. And the other thing is that Marx very clearly criticizes Hegel for his views on the bureaucracy. So whereas Hegel thinks that the bureaucracy is this kind of like neutral actor who defends the common good of everyone, Marx says that that's just not true. They actually defend their own interest. And that what we instead need is an idea in which citizens themselves carry out the public administration of the state. Where he says, we want the universal class to be really universal, then it has to be the class of every citizen. Right? So everyone needs to be a citizen administrator. Now, that's the kind of political vision that Marx sets out in his early writings. Now, over the course of 1843, 1844, he kind of transitions from that position to a communist one. And now this is kind of maybe the heart of the book, is that I try to set out the ways in which that both meant an integration of some Republican ideas and a rejection of some other ones. And it's, I think, maybe useful there to divide that into kind of political and social things, what the inheritance involves. So on the political front, what does Marx take from republicanism when he becomes a communist? So I think the really important thing to realize about socialism before Marx comes onto the scene, and this is easily forgotten. Sometimes Marx gets presented as, the first socialist, as if socialism didn't exist before him. Socialism existed 30 years before Marx comes onto the scene, at least, right? There is already a long set of established discussions and debates about what socialism should look like, what political strategies it should have, and so forth, that all predates Marx. And he kind of enters that, that existing debate. And what I think, one important theme to pick out there is that, the very early kinds of socialism are incredibly anti-political in a way that I think might be very hard for us to grasp the extent to which that is. And by anti-political, I mean is that, of course, socialists nearly always have some degree of anti-politics because, we are skeptical of the idea that, the only thing that matters is political reform or something like that, because we believe in the importance of social reform and revolution and so forth. But there can be even more stricter forms of anti-politics where you reject any participation in government, any idea that it's important to understand that the world is deeply riven by conflict and you have to understand those political conflicts. And, what alternative political strategies that might lead you to. So kind of, in typical statements, this is an early socialist, Hermann Semmig, who Marx and Engels respond to. He tells us, will the Republic pay our debts? Will it redeem our pawned goods? Will it clothe and feed us? It will not. The causes of our social hardships and evils lie deeper than defective state institutions, and so no political institutions are capable of abolishing them. And so what that meant for these socialists is that they were actually rejected the Republican inheritance at the time. So they said, actually, no, we have no interest in establishing a democratic republic, right? We're not going to take part in the revolution that you Republicans are planning and have been trying to plan since the French Revolution. That holds no interest for us because we think that will make no difference to the social reform whatsoever. And that kind of idea influences all kinds of range of early socialist ideas. It's very important for the so-called utopian socialists, people like Robert Owen or Charles Fourier, who have this idea that it's really important to set up these communitarian experiments, for example, often in the American so-called wilderness. Well, it's not actually that wild, it's of course, and that, we just need to, retreat from society, retreat from politics, and just build up these things. And then their example will peacefully spread around the world. Very, very influential idea in the early part of socialism. And even when Marx and Engels come into the scene. And what is so important about what Marx and Engels do when they become communists in the lead up to the 1840 revolution is that they decisively reject this communist anti-politics. And that's even interestingly the case even before Marx becomes a communist. He's already criticizing communists as the existing socialists for doing this. So he says the critic not only can, but must deal with these political questions, which according to the extreme socialists are altogether unworthy of attention. That's already a view he holds when he's a Republican, and he takes that view with him when he becomes a communist. And he makes it absolutely central to the communism that him and Engels build in the years before 1848. That the idea of a democratic republic is absolutely essential to establishing communism, that needs to be brought about through a revolution, and that then there can be further discussion about what bringing about the communist revolution after that. But it is an absolutely necessary precondition for socialism. And you see that in the Communist Manifesto, where the kind of very core political claim that it makes is that the first step in the revolution by the working class is the fight for democracy. And that is something that they actually had to fight for, that position. So the organization for which the manifesto is written was not committed to that before Marx and Engels came onto the scene. They had to fight other forms of socialism that didn't agree with that political strategy. And the Communist Manifesto also criticizes other forms of socialism that reject all political and especially revolutionary action. And okay, so that's the way Marx integrates republicanism in a political sense. But I think there's also important is that in those years, as much as he really integrates the importance of a democratic republic, it's a rather thin sense of what he thinks is necessary. So these early ideas about this really expansive sense of political participation, taking part in public administration with citizen administrators and so forth, and having tight control of your representatives, we don't really find that in this period of writing. So he does inherit, makes a very important, integration of republicanism to his communism, but not a full integration, that we might say. Okay, so that's on the political side in Marx's kind of relationship to republicanism. Let me talk a little bit about the social side. So I talked about the idea, how important the idea of Republican freedom was in Marx's early writings, when he was using it to kind of criticize, make a political criticism of the Prussian regime and its arbitrariness. And I think what's so interesting about Marx's social writings is that this idea that you are unfree if you are subjected to arbitrary power makes its way into his social criticisms as well. And you see that throughout Capital, for instance. And so I'll explain these pictures in a moment. So Marx tells us in Capital that in the factory code, the capitalist formulates his autocratic power over his workers like a private legislator, and purely as an emanation of his own will, unaccompanied by either the separation of powers otherwise so much approved of by the bourgeoisie or the still more approved representative system. And so what he's saying there is that the kind of old feudal monarchical power, I've got the picture there of Henry VIII on top left, that is unacceptable to, let's say, to liberals and conservatives, or to liberals in the 19th century, because that's, an example of autocratic power in the political sphere. But they're hypocritical because in the social sphere, so when people go to work, it's entirely acceptable to them that they are exposed to this kind of arbitrary power, because the employer in the factory can do what they like with their employees, with their workers as they like. They are subjected to arbitrary power within the factory, and they are made unfree as a result of it. So what you get is a kind of transferal from that political Republican argument to a kind of social Republican argument in Marx's Capital. And it's very nice, where Marx, the paragraph where Marx says this in Capital, he then immediately cites a long paragraph from Engels, what Engels had written. And Engels wrote right there, the slavery in which the bourgeoisie holds the proletariat chained is nowhere more conspicuous than in the factory system. Here ends all freedom in law and in fact. Inside the factory, the employer is absolute lawgiver. He makes regulations at will, change and adds to his codex at pleasure. So again, this idea of having arbitrary power over your employees. And that's a way in which Marx integrates, that's Republican ideas into his social critique. And yet at the same time, he's still criticizing Republicans for their not anti-communist views. So while Republicans believe that property has to be universalized as a way to respond to capitalism, Marx and Engels argue that property has to be abolished and common ownership universalized instead. Okay. So that gives you a sense of the way, I hope, the way in which this first two phases in which Marx's relationship to republicanism. And the very final part of the book, shortest part, but it's the way in which I talk about what then happened in response to the Paris Commune. So the Paris Commune, I don't know how many people are with it, but the working class uprising that happens in 1871, when the workers of the city managed to briefly control the city for about 2 months or so. And this is hugely influential for Marx and his political thought, because he changes his views about what political structures are necessary for bringing about socialism. So as previously he had thought a democratic republic, much like we have today, universal suffrage, representation, civic rights, that's the thing that we need to fight for. Then with the Paris Commune, he realizes actually we need something much more democratic than that. We need what he calls a social republic. And that has two key elements, I would say. One is about representation, so that our representatives now need to be much more tightly controlled than we're used to today. So there need to be perhaps frequent elections, annual elections, as in the Chartist idea. We need to have the right to recall our representatives, so we don't just vote them out at the end of 4 years. We can do so immediately, and that we give them what's called an imperative mandate. So we give them binding instructions. And Marx says that means instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent the people in parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people. So we see a transformation of what representation would mean through those measures. And the second one is about public administration. So Marx thinks it's incredibly important that we take over popular control of the state administration, and that means subjecting it to kind of legislative oversight and electing a large number of its posts and paying them all workmen's wages. And he means that that will turn the haughtiest masters of the people into its always removable servants, a mock responsibility by a real responsibility, as they act continuously under public supervision. And this, I argue, is a kind of reintegration of his very earliest republicanism, ideas of political ideas, into his communism, to argue that we need a much more extensive democratic state to bring about a communist society. And there, I say, a fuller synthesis of his republicanism and socialism. Now, I see that I've already got a few minutes over time. If I have a couple more minutes, I can maybe talk. I have 2 more slides where I was going to say.
Please. Yes, please take your time. No problem.
Okay, great. I won't take much more than 2 minutes. So that, as you know, you've been listening I hope, very patiently, about some of the historical sides of this. What do I think is actually the outcome of all of this historical research? Well, I kind of end the book with 2 thoughts that I think what we might learn from this study of Marx and republicanism that I think might be of interest to socialists today. The first is about Marx and freedom. So this, I think, this picture, from, I think this is the January 6th insurrection, I think presents what a lot of people think is about Marx and freedom, right? He is the enemy of freedom, right? Socialists are the enemy of freedom, I suppose. And what the book is trying to, of course, I think that, we all know that that's not the case. But I think what I would think is that socialists, I think, have a reason to embrace the value of freedom much more fully than we have so far, or tended to do. So sometimes socialism only gets presented as a value about equality or community or something like this. And those are part of, what socialists care about. But I think freedom is actually really at the heart, especially if you read through the 19th century, if you read Marx's writings, it's his most central value. And I think specifically the idea of republican freedom, right? This idea about arbitrary power, which, gives you the tools to criticize political domination. It allows you to criticize social domination, the power of the capitalist, the power of the capitalist class and the market, all these forms of arbitrary power. And I think that's a way in which socialists might kind of take back the value of freedom from liberals and conservatives and make it their own. Now, the second one is about democracy. I hope you'll excuse these. I couldn't find any good pictures about Marx and democracy, so I just pulled these ones from the Google search. The second one is about radical political institutions. So if, Marx criticized capitalism for making us unfree and for dominating us, he at the same time argued that the way to overcome that by the end of his life was through these radical democratic political structures. And that, I think, is a really key insight, the importance of political institutions and democratic political institutions to socialist transformation, right? And by democracy, that doesn't just mean what is understood by democracy today, right? I mean, I think that, there's very good historical work that shows that the regimes that we call democratic, the people who founded them did not think that they were setting up democracies. They were, in fact, explicitly opposed to democracy. If you read, for example, the accounts of the American founders, the Federalists, they were not setting up democracies. And what Marx is defending is, I think, a much more truly democratic system, right? With real control over government and administration and the importance of that to socialist transformation. So it's that link between the political and the social. And so those are the two kind of outcomes that I think I would hope to see that the book maybe has some broader contribution to make. And thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm very excited to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, comrade. That was very fascinating, really good presentation. I enjoyed it immensely. I have not actually read your book, but I will get onto it straight after this. So thanks very much for presenting that. Now, I've got a couple of questions for you before I bring people in from the floor. Comrades, if you have a question or want to make a contribution, please click raise hand. And that is, I mean, I think it's really important that you, I think you seem to successfully reclaim the fight for democratic republic that was at the heart of Marx's work. And I think they say somewhere that it's the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It will take the form of the democratic republic. And it is, as you said, the precondition for socialism. It is not by itself leading to socialism, but it is the precondition that will be the shape of the state in which we can fight for socialism and then for communism. So that's a really important part. I think that's in your book. What I'm slightly puzzled about is your distinction between democracy and republicanism, and you seem to make a distinction between the two. Do you think they are separate, or is republicanism a part of his democracy? I mean, we've been talking about in our series, Why Marx, on the crucial role of democracy in Marx thought, and always thought that republicanism is a part of that. But you seem to put it at the top almost. So how do you describe that relationship between republicanism and democracy?
Thank you, Tina. That's a really great and important question. So I think I would say that it's helpful if you think about, let's say, republicanism over the course of its history, because let's say republicanism is a very old idea, it goes all the way back to Rome, Athens, Renaissance city-states, and so forth, that it has aristocratic and democratic elements to it, right? So one way you can think about it is if you take power away from the king, you can either invest it in the few, the aristocracy, or in the many, the democracy, as it were. And that's the kind of history of republicanism up until the 19th century. In the 19th century, however, that kind of aristocratic republicanism doesn't exist anymore. Republicanism as it exists, as it is talked about, the people who define themselves as Republicans are Democrats. Right, so democracy and republicanism are, well, they're not the same thing because one is an ideology and one is a form of state, but republicanism is as I tried to say, the ideology of democracy, right? It is the political movement that is attached to bringing about democracy in that sense. So while it had different meanings before the 19th century, right, where you might have talked about democratic and non-democratic forms of republicanism, that is not the case in the 19th century anymore, where it is just thoroughly democratic. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had the subtitle Organ der Demokratie, and exactly. It was linked to, wasn't it? I mean, they were supporters of the bourgeois revolution, or perhaps you call that a Republican revolution. And how do you see their role in pushing, that Organ der Demokratie forward?
Well, I think that it's very important to understand their role in the 1848 revolutions in Germany and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which you rightly point out, its subtitle is Organ der Demokratie, is that they were really pushing their strategy, or a Republican strategy, which is that Germany needs to become a democratic republic in 1848, and then we can talk about communism. So they actually kind of somewhat controversially by other communist standards at the time who wanted to kind of carry out active communist agitation, they actually say, this is very explicitly their strategy, we need to be Republicans before we can be communists, in a way. And you say, what is, is a bourgeois revolution a Republican revolution? So this is an interesting discussion. And I think it comes down to kind of the differences between republicanism and liberalism a little bit here. So you know, the majority of, let's say, the Frankfurt Assembly, which is the assembly that is trying to set up a united Germany in 1848, is dominated by liberals who want Germany to become a constitutional monarchy, right? A kind of somewhat bourgeois regime that is even politically bourgeois in that it's supposed to exclude the people from political power as well. They're supposed to have a little bit of power, but they're not supposed to be in power. And that would be the difference between a republican revolution, right? One that really does establish a proper well, at least a democracy in the sense of universal suffrage, right? Which is now, I guess, taken as a somewhat basic demand, but then utterly revolutionary as a demand. That's how maybe some of the differences I would say between republicanism and bourgeois and what their roles in the revolution were.
What about then, for example, something, I mean, you described how their attitude changed to the state and to the ruling class as well. And the question of the state, how Marx and Engels in particular viewed getting rid of the state, because there's this rather famous quote of them hoping the state will wither away under socialism. And that changed as well, didn't it? For example, with the Paris Commune, the experience from the Paris Commune. Can you explain that a little bit if you know a bit more about that?
Yes, yeah, that's actually, that's the very final part of my book where I talk about this idea of the end of politics or the withering away of the state. Just not a phrase that Marx ever uses, but it became attached to him through, there's a kind of interesting translation story that I talk about in a footnote if anyone's interested in the book about that. But the idea that, there's this, and there's, Marx and Engels, again, are not the first people to think about this, about the idea that, someday in the future, once we reach communism, that politics will disappear, right? That the state disappears, that politics disappears. And I would say that is, of course, not a Republican idea at all, right? That there's nothing that could be further from republicanism than the idea of a society without politics. And it's certainly something that it is part of that kind of anti-political heritage that socialism has. And I would say that now Marx is often thought to just simply buy into that idea, that he just straightforwardly thinks that there is an end to politics. And I try and complicate that story a little bit at the end of the book, so that I would say that it's not that Marx thinks that politics necessarily will end, which I think is a slightly different question from whether the state ends or not. I think we should have a broader conception of politics compared to the state, but I think that Marx is just opposed to very detailed thinking about this. And this is not a new thought. We know, of course, that Marx is an anti-utopian thinker. He thinks it's a waste of time to drawing up plans for what the future might look like. Now, I agree with aspects of that idea, but I think that's also, there can be a danger in thinking that, it can also affect how you think about today and you think about transition if you think about the future will take a certain will look in a certain way. And I certainly think that the kind of anti-political view of the future, the idea that there could be a society without politics, is a deeply misguided one, and one that I think has caused problems for socialist thought about politics, even if it, can sometimes seem like a very remote idea. What does, the society in 200 years' time look like? But I think it has been a mistaken one, and I would say that Marx and Engels buy into it to some extent, but not nearly as much as people often presume them to do, but there are elements of that there. But I do try to emphasize in the book, this is also, their idea about the very far future rather than, what their actual political agitation meant on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
I think quite right. I think there's the idea of permanent revolution, isn't it? That we even if we win, we'll have to lose until we win. There'd be struggle after strugglers. But even when we win, that won't be the end of it. You have to constantly remake the revolution, and it doesn't just stop. Communism is not like the pigeons flying around. You just grab food from the, you constantly have to make it and remake it. And I do like your idea, and I think it's absolutely important that as socialists, as communists, as Marxists, we look back, being from Germany, we had the East Germany next door. That was socialism, real socialism. And I think that's still how many people see it. USSR, obviously, it's the opposite of socialism. Actually, it started off as a proletarian dictatorship, but it turned into an actual dictatorship. It turned into the dictatorship over the working class. So it's, I think, extremely important that Marx reclaim democracy and reclaim the fight for what actually Marx and Engels perceived democracy to be. We've got a couple of people with a hand up, but I'm not sure if they actually wanted to ask a question or if that's a mistake. David McGimpsey, did you want to come in? You can now speak. I've unmuted you. Possibly not. Okay, if you want to, if anybody wants to come in, please click raise hand, or I can also read out your question in the Q&A. Steve Freeman, please. He's actually introduced us to you, so thanks, Steve.
Bruno, fantastic. A brilliant piece of work, I have to say, and I hope it will spread, because it's in many ways a very radical critique of present day communism, Trotskyism, Stalinism, and all the rest of it, which actually completely dominates the British left. Because in a way, what Stalinism did was it gave us a democratic bypass, it gave us a Republican bypass, and those ideas are lost. And what you've done is remine them, redig them up, and show that they were so important, so central to understanding the development of Marx's ideas in a dialectical way, by the way, because I think a good term for Marx, if we had to have another term, suppose we can't, we banned the term Marxism. Let's call it something else, just for the sake of argument. We'd call it, I think we should call it Republican communism. And by that I mean there's a Republican road to communism, and that's the road that you have to travel. And my understanding of what you've done is unearth, dig out, find, highlight this Republican road to communism. But Marx didn't start as a Republican communist, as you show. His ideas evolved dialectically from republicanism, almost rejecting it for communism in a certain sense. So that's the antithesis of if the thesis is republicanism, its antithesis is kind of communism, but not completely, as you say, because the Republican strand carries on through it. And then there's this synthesis of his earlier republicanism with the Paris Commune. You know, that's really what is the people that show Marx. It's the working class that show Marx really where republicanism is through the events in the Paris Commune. So he really stitches it all together in what I see as the thesis, antithesis, the synthesis of those ideas into a kind of Republican communism. And you can certainly see that if you look onto Lenin, and you can see that all the way through. But against it, of course, is a kind of I'd call it anarcho-communism, which is another version of communism, which you could link to Proudhon, Bakunin, and others, which I still think is economism, as you say. It's not political in a certain sense, that whole strand that you spoke about. And I think it goes right the way through Stalinism and into left reformism. So I think what you're doing here is if people read your book and understand what you're saying, and it's part of the development of our ideas, I think it's got a massive contribution to make to actually changing the way the left in England, because there is no republicanism in the English left. There really isn't. I mean, what we've got here is we've got anti-monarchism at best. So the English left thinks, yeah, well, what's republicanism about? Oh, get rid of King Charles. We don't want King Charles. That's about the sum total of it, really. And I think what you've shown us and what you've explained is how it's so important to Marx's ideas of freedom and linking between freedom, democracy, and republicanism. That is such a core essence of what Marx is about. And communism, you could say, was the final piece of freedom, you know, when we achieve freedom in a certain sense. But we can't get there without the struggle. So I think what you've done is a very important contribution to the necessary need to reform the left in England, to rechange it from I think, the history of Stalinism and Trotskyism, which has done us failed actually in many ways in the post-war period. We're at the end of that period. We have to discover something else. So I just end up by saying congratulations to you. And we discovered you by accident because we read your thesis. We were already on this track in our own way, but obviously because we were looking around for it, we came across your original PhD thesis, as you know, and that's how this was before the book was written, and we started reading that and looking at it as well. So it was a great contribution. So fantastic, well done.
Thanks, Steve. Anything you want to reply to, Steve?
Oh, well, that's just very, very kind words, Steve. I hope it has half the effect that you predicted has. That I would be very grateful. And yeah, the idea of calling it Republican communism sounds very good to me. I mean, I think Marx and Engels only used that label once. They certainly call themselves democratic communists at one point. But yeah, I think it's a great label, and I certainly hope it has something like the effect that you said it would. Thank you very much. That's very kind, Steve.
Carl, you have something wrong with your camera, but you can speak now if you want.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. I think I'm probably either going to make myself sound really stupid in that I haven't got the general premise of what the book's outlining, or I might unlock the question that makes it all clear to me. When I hear the term Republican, it can evoke fear, sort of thoughts of people like Patrick Pearse, who was an Irish Republican, Arthur Griffiths, who was also Irish Republican. But the key thing with those two, particularly Griffiths, was that he wanted to keep the capitalist system in place whilst establishing a republic. He wanted the exploiters in a capitalist system to be exploiters for the benefit of Irish capitalists rather than British ones. So when you say a communist, you might think of James Connolly, who is defined as a Republican, but there's no, people might try and split the two in that whether he was more Republican than he was communist or socialist, whereas the two were combined, and that I think is the key. Is it not a condition of being a communist that you're a Republican? Are we saying that republicanism is more important than other aspects of Marxism, such as materialism or dialectics? For me, Marx sort of come to define what communism is, and that was by incorporating things like republicanism and then taking Hegelian philosophy and developing that into materialism. So as I say, I'm sure it's me and not you, but I'm still unclear because the analysis that you've given Marxism all seemed sound. I'm just wondering why the prominence on republicanism. Is this trying to develop Marx's the Marxist ideology to put more prominence on republicanism, or is it more a historical analysis of all those things you've just focused on republicanism that all combine to become what we see as Marxism? With what Steve's just said, we're too engrossed with Trotskyism. Well, I'm pretty sure Trotsky would have considered himself a Republican. So is this an attempt to build on the ideas of communism and as Steve was just to move them forward, or more of an analysis of some of the components, in this case republicanism, that built up what we would regard as communists today?
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carl. That was a really good question, actually. And I mean, I think that, I think the confusion is, let me see if I can try and help a little bit, or like maybe explain a little bit further, because I think what you're getting at is that the term republicanism is a difficult one insofar as it has just changed meanings and continues to change meanings all the time, right? So it's not always clear what it means. So as you say, like in Ireland, it has a very specific meaning that you believe in a united state on the island of Ireland that is free from British control, right? That is what republicanism means to, you mentioned some various figures, but that is only, its modern meaning, right? So it has an older meaning, which is more than just that, right? It means something about what kind of state you would want, right? What kind of society you would want, right? It's a thicker ideology than just that view about an independence from Britain, as it were. And that's why it's really interesting that you raised James Connolly as well. So actually, I end the book with a couple of quotes from James Connolly, because I think he's one of the really nice examples of someone who very self-consciously brings together his republicanism and socialism. And republicanism means for him It does mean independence from Britain, of course, because that is part of what, let's say, freedom entails, that you're not dominated by a foreign power. But independence also means you're not dominated, as you say, by Irish capitalists as well. So you don't just set up a new form of domination in the domestic sphere, despite having removed the colonial shackles, as it were. And so that's why I think it's quite helpful to kind of go back to that kind of older view of what republicanism means as well. And so, why am I giving it this prominence? What does it mean in relation, how important is it compared to, let's say materialism or other things that you talked about? And you even said, I think, is it, are all communists Republicans? And so I'd say that, no, it's importantly, not all communists are Republicans. So certainly, I don't want to go too much in the 20th century because that gets a bit complicated, but at least in the 19th century, there are plenty of communists at the time that Marx is writing that are not Republicans. People like Wilhelm Weitling, Etienne Cabet, forgotten names now, but very, huge figures in the 19th century who had major followings that were much more well-known than Marx for most of his life. They were not Republicans, right? They did not think it was important to establish, to transform, to revolutionize political institutions. They thought we needed to escape from all of that, right? So it's not that you're not necessarily a Republican if you're a communist. They are separate, positions, and you can combine them or not combine them, as it were. And then I wouldn't see republicanism as being, let's say, in competition with something like materialism. I think that's just I'd say it's in competition with whether, let's say, you are, well, a non-Republican, whether a communist or a liberal communist maybe, or something like that. That's the plane in which the kind of comparison happens. You certainly can still be a materialist in that way, and combine that with republicanism. That's not where I think that's not competing with something like that, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Bruno. Jeff, please.
Mute.
There you
Right,
are.
I think you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
I was impressed. I looked on in advance at the cost of your book, and I thought 35 quid, quite a lot of money. But then, as academic books go, probably fairly cheap. Some of them are ridiculous. A couple of questions. First one, would you like to say something about Marx and equality? Second question, I think I first came across this question of democracy and liberal democracy reading Macpherson, the Canadian Marxist, in the 60s, dare I admit. And he made the point that essentially you establish a firm liberal regime, which is not democratic, and then add a few democratic features to it after the event. But of course, it's not democracy. We live under a regime which has a democratic component, but which is not itself democratic. And I think the last general election has demonstrated that beyond any belief. So I'd like to ask for your comments on those points. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, well, I hope that I've now convinced you that £35 is worth it. I mean, if I had my choice, it would be a lot cheaper. I was glad that, it is an academic publisher. The fact that it was £35 was cheaper than it could have been. And hopefully, if it sells enough copies, it'll come out as a paperback and make it a little bit more affordable. It'll also be available on all the standard Russian sites where you can download it for free. So that'll happen, I'm sure. Well, so you asked about Marx and equality and Marx and democracy. So what do I say about equality? So yeah, like one ambition in the book is to try and say that I think, if you asked, most people what, Marx's central value is, I think a lot of people would say equality. And yet actually Marx had very little time for the idea of equality. Now that might have been because he had a quite limited sense of what equality could mean. So for him, equality basically just meant equal property holdings, right? And that does, I think you can have more sophisticated understandings of equality. And if you have more sophisticated understandings of equality, where it can be about, broader things than, let's say, just, how much resources you hold, then you can maybe do something with it. But that ideal of equality, Marx was very critical of, right? He thought that it was not something to strive for. It was not, had various kinds of problems, didn't take account of need and all of these ideas. And that's what I'm trying to say with the book, that really the value that he appeals to over and over again is actually freedom, right? It really is his central value. Now, I think Republican freedom is one element of what he means by freedom. I should say that also I don't think that there are other elements to what he says about freedom. So I wouldn't try to say that republicanism is the only part of what he says about freedom. But anyway, that's a little bit about on Marx and equality. And then on Marx and democracy, yeah, so I fully agree with you the way you've phrased it, Jeff, that, we live in regimes that have democratic components, but they are not themselves democracies. I would call the regimes that we live in today as representative governments. I think that's the much more helpful term to understand them. That's how they were set up and what they were called when they were set up and such. And they mix democratic and aristocratic and oligarchic elements within them, right? So the democratic elements obviously is universal suffrage, right? Which is a fight that was won to make the regime more democratic. But I would argue, and I think that's what, Jeff, you were getting at, that doesn't make it a democracy overall. And, one of the things that I think that comes out of I'm trying to say with the book is that, some of the elements that are missing for him for making it a real democracy, and he refers to the idea of a true democracy when he's talking about the Paris Commune, is that we don't have real control over our representatives and that we don't have real control over the state administration. And those two things mean that we don't live in a real democracy, according to Marx.
Thanks very much. And would you like to say something about the idea that Marx presents that the state is an illusionary community and that what's required is the power of a community, and that these are quite different?
Well, that I gotta say, Jeff, I think I know less what I would say about that. I think he certainly thinks that the state mystifies things in various ways, perhaps. Certainly, the way he criticizes Hegel for kind of embodying it with kind of this kind of awesome power to some extent. I don't really know quite what I would say to what he thinks how that would be different in a communist society, if that's what you get, what kind of different community it might be. So I think that's a less satisfying answer to maybe the other questions, Jeff. I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, oh, sorry, Jeff, were you still asking something? Sorry.
No, I wasn't still asking anything.
All right, sorry.
Other people.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think there's a quote. Is it from Marx? If we're all bureaucrats running the state, then none of us are bureaucrats, basically. If we all take power, then nobody's in charge, basically. So actually, we haven't got anybody with their hands up, but I've got one more question, and I think that's I think for me the crucial question. So if you read the Communist Manifesto, I mean, democracy, republicanism is all over it. Every lefty will have read it. Every lefty says, yeah, read that. That gives you a good introduction to communism and to Marx, etc. In it, I believe it's quite strong about winning the battle for democracy, for example, that the working class has to take democracy seriously and, take seriously the way we're ruled and the way we can rule and should rule in the future. Why do you think so much of the left, of the Marxist left, ignores this kind of heritage to take seriously, to try and win the battle of democracy and take those issues of how we are ruled seriously? Most of the left wants to concentrate more on, let's say, the sort of trade union issues, save the NHS, all important issues, but leaves aside anything that sort of touches the state. They might say, yes, abolish the House of Lords. Yeah, why not? Abolish the monarchy, but not putting it at the center of their theory. Whereas I'd say real Marxists would put that at the center, because it actually goes to the heart of how we're ruled, and that what makes us, isn't it? That makes us communists. Not that the NHS has enough money, but that we are in charge. That it's the working class being trained and becoming the ruling class, really. And I think that's why Marx put it so much at the center. Why do you think is the left doesn't really do that in its majority?
Thank you. That's a huge question, it's a super important one, and I'll try my best to say something about it. So, first off, maybe as you cite, you're citing this very important line from the manifesto, right? This battle of winning the battle of democracy, right? And I think that already, I think, kind of gets to a heart of some of the problems, insofar as I think that line is badly translated in the English version. So in German, it's Die Erkämpfung der Demokratie. And I think what Marx and Engels mean by that in 1848 is the battle for democracy, which means the establishment of a democratic regime. We need to fight to create it. Whereas the later translation, which makes sense because it's later, because it's talking about a different situation, talks about the battle, winning the battle of democracy, which is really a question about what is your strategy within a democratic state, which is also a massively important question, but it's a different question, right? And I think that's just a bit revealing into, to what all of these different questions can mean and the importance of them. And what does and this why does, let's say, so much of the left focus, let's say, on social issues at the neglect of political institutions? And I mean, this is a story that I think it's basically, I would say that quite soon after Marx's death, I think there's a big change in socialist politics, where rather than believing that it was necessary to transform the state into this such more radical democratic idea, the idea then focused much more became focused on the idea of the party, and that the party would be the necessary link that makes the state more democratic. And I think that's actually quite a plausible idea in lots of ways, right? So, if the big problem with, representative government is that you have no control of your representatives, parties give you control over your representatives if those parties are properly democratically controlled. And this is a lot of what Karl Kautsky, for example, writes, things like the imperative mandate are outdated because they're replaced by the party. And that's, I think, a really important thing that happens in the 20th century. And while parties operated relatively effectively and were mass parties that held true to a degree, with their decline, we see a lot of reemergence of the kind of oligarchic tendencies of representative government. And I think that is one aspect to, why have socialists cared more about, let's say, just, thinking we'll do the social stuff and, the political stuff, maybe that'll come later, but it's not important. And I think that's, it's a real shame that has been the case, because I think it's misguided, because I think that the terrain on which you fight is very important as to what will be the outcome of that fight. I think that's should be a relatively uncontroversial point, but I think it's been easily forgotten. And I think it's easy just to, hoof political reform down, further down, as you mentioned, abolishing the House of Lords and so forth, right? These things are just thought to be like, and I mean, it deeply infects the entire approach of the Labour Party, which has always been at its core that that the Labour Party will take over the institutions of the British state and it will turn them towards socialism, right? And that the British state is fine in its current guise. And, there's a very nice quote from, I can't remember who says it, but Anthony Barnett quotes it quite a lot, that, trying to get socialism from the British state is like trying to get milk from a vulture, right? That it's just not this, the British state is constitutionally set up to limit popular power, right? And so the idea that you can just take it over and, and make it do what you want is, I think, deeply misguided. And I think that's one of the things I'm really trying to push with the book, is that Marx comes to that realization when the Paris Commune. He says, we can't this thing that has been built by our enemies is not going to allow us to carry out the transformation we want. And that's why you really have to think political and social transformation together.
And overthrow the state. We've got one more question now, Carol.
Yes, thank you very much, Bruno. I totally agree with what you just said. Only we tend to call the state the crown, and it's no democracy in that situation at all. Now, I think the vision that you have, or the vision, and we have as well, of this participatory democracy is marvelous. But there's only one thing that really worries me. I'd love to see it happening. There's only one thing that worries me. Will people step up to the mark? Because with those rights, with that democracy comes responsibility. And it means that people will have to step up, and they will have to be part of citizens' assemblies. They will have to be part of their communities and in running their communities. And I've got this sneaking fear in the back of my mind. It all sounds wonderful, and I absolutely would love to see it happen. But will people step up and take their responsibilities seriously?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. Well, I mean, I don't know. It depends. I think it depends on which institutions we set up, of course, right? I mean, participatory democracy is a very broad field of options and institutional reforms that one could take part in. I mean, the thing about, you mentioned citizen assemblies is that in some ways, of course, certainly if like participation is made mandatory in these kind of sortition or lottery institutions, then people don't have a choice about participating, right? which doesn't sound good, but I think is actually important, because a lot of these citizens' assemblies, they claim to be very representative, but when it comes down to it, because they're volunteer run, they basically get dominated by the most educated, which means that they're really not actually representative of the working class at all, despite claiming to be so. So I think actually there's a reason to care about those institutions being mandatory, much like jury service is. And will they step up? Well, I think that they won't just step up naturally and, of their own accord. This is why I think there is a role for parties, or a very central role for parties, is that there has to be organization of people, right? I don't think there's kind of like there's latent tendencies there, but without organization, none of those come to pass. And of course, it's very easy to set up kind of dead state institutions if there's no surrounding political culture that actually gets people to participate in them.
Yeah, good answer. I also think that if people have the possibility to exercise some control over their lives and their surroundings, they would want to do it. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to, if you don't want to, you don't have to spend 10 hours a day planning whatever local street, whatever. That wouldn't be my kind of cup of tea either, or potholes and that kind of things. But people get involved on different levels, isn't it? Even if it's a mutual relationship. I think the more control and power you have over your surroundings, the more you want to exercise it. So we're totally living in an alienated way at the moment, with no control, not even our, the work, etc. But that could change, and it would be a process. I think we'll be changing. Bruno, thank you very much. Do you have anything to sum up, or any final words you'd want to say?
No, I'm just very, 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 very grateful for the opportunity, and it was so great to hear all of your questions. And thank you again for John for talking about the strike earlier as well. I
think that was a really good session.
And really for organizing it as well. Thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you very much, comrade. Comrades, join us next week. We'll be taking a look at Shakespeare. We have, you might remember, Roger Silverman gave an introduction on Shakespeare once, and we had Luke Podromu, who contradicted him on quite a few things, so he's now getting his own session. We're starting with Marxist approach to Shakespeare, War and Revolution. He's actually produced a series of openings to look at various aspects, so that should be very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you, John. I think you had to leave the meeting, but good night, comrades.